Hi, and welcome to another video in our Be WorkWise, Be TeamWise program, a program looking at how to be more effective as a team member, a team leader, and a team in general. I'm Dr. Sean, and today we're going to be looking at Tuchman's model. And as a team development model, it's probably one of the most popular ones out there and one of the oldest ones out there. But it's also been facing a lot of criticism of late. So in this video, we'll get into what it is, why it's been criticized, and why we still use it at the WorkWise Institute, because we think it's pretty cool. Our story really starts with this man, Dr. Bruce Tuckman. Tuckman began his career as part of a small group of social psychologists in a think tank setting that was studying behavior for the United States Navy. At the time, his boss, Erwin Altman, had been collecting just about every article he could find on group development and passed those over to Tuckman, basically said, do what you can with these. So Tuckman took the papers and after an in-depth study did two really important things. First, he separated out two realms of group functioning. That's the interpersonal or group structure realm and then the task activity realm. Now, this is a recurring theme that's quite important, and we're going to see it in a number of videos we make in terms of teams, because team performance, and actually performance in general, is usually related to these two things. The person or the individual or the people in the team and their capabilities, and then the task or the complexity of the activities that are required to achieve the task objectives. So we already have two key themes emerging there. Then he did a second very important thing when he looked for a developmental sequence that would fit the findings of the majority of the studies he was looking at. And it was in the developmental sequence that the magic really started to happen for Tuckman. This is where he discovered the 4 stages in both the people and the task realms. For example, in the people realm, he saw groups going from an initial orientation and testing phase through to conflict, then group cohesion, and finally functional role relatedness. In the task realm, we move from, for example, an initial set of activities around orientation and testing, all the way through to insight in the final stage. Now, we can see that the terms and phrases used in the studies were quite heavy, and thankfully Tuckman translated these into the terms forming, storming, norming, and performing to describe them. And in doing so, he struck gold. In 1965, after initially rejecting the paper, the Psychological Bulletin finally published his breakthrough article titled Developmental Sequence in Small Groups. And that was describing what would later become the Tuckman stages of group development, and as we know it today, Tuckman's model. So before we get to the so what question, some of you with eagle eyes may have noticed that in our initial slide, we had 5 stages, not 4. And this is because in a subsequent 1977 article called Stages of Small Group Development Revisited, Tuckman and his co-author Mary Ann Jensen identified the importance of how groups ended and the various behaviors that occur, and that's why adjourning was added to the model as a 5th stage. Remember, their research was largely on clinical groups, and you can see why then that with these groups coming to an end, or as the groups start to split up, there is a potential for added anxiety and other emotional challenges to emerge. Now, this doesn't mean that it's not important for team development in general, particularly in modern workplaces where it's common that teams are created for a variety of purposes and then disbanded and recreated for other purposes. So ensuring that the team is on good terms when it ends is obviously important and is actually one of the criteria we use when identifying whether a team is high performing or not. If a team is able to meet its task objectives but tears itself to pieces in the process, that is not what we would consider a very high performing team. So back to the question of so what? Ultimately, what the stages model helps us do is identify quite broadly where we may be in our journey to team maturity. And that's both its strength and its greatest weakness. So for example, if we know a team is only just getting started, there's going to be a need for the team leader to ensure that everyone is on the same page. Now, that sounds pretty obvious, but we tend to find that it's actually pretty badly handled, and often people don't even know who is actually on the team, let alone what they're trying to achieve as a team. And in addition to that, sometimes we don't even need a team to accomplish the task in the first place, and so when we try to create one and make it do teamwork, that only creates extra frustration and wastes resources. And so we can take this further, and once the niceties and the politeness that we see in the forming stage start to wear off, we need to be on the lookout for conflict. So firstly, we need to acknowledge that some conflict is good, or at least some types of conflict are good, such as the ideational conflict that Patrick Lencioni describes, which is basically where we're arguing over ideas and not necessarily attacking people. But regardless of the nature or type of conflict, be prepared, because it will happen and it needs to be dealt with rather than avoided. So here, a team leader in particular, but also the team members in general, need to know how to deal with conflict effectively, especially the various styles that people use to approach conflict, but also by ensuring that there are processes to move forward from the conflict. And this may sometimes require outside help, because people can get stuck in the conflict and never really get out of it effectively. And we also need to preempt conflict by trying to build psychological safety and trust, and we'll cover those topics in other videos. So again, like in the forming stage, where we know that we need to get everyone on the same page, but not necessarily how we would do that, it can be quite easy to identify that we're in the storming stage, but get stuck there because we don't know what to do about it. So we have the strength of Tuchman again being able to diagnose a particular stage, but the weakness being that the model doesn't necessarily help us progress to the next one. It doesn't prescribe the rules of the game, but also that's not what the model was designed to do. So please don't take this as a value judgment against Tuchman and the utility of the model. It's not meant to be. The idea is that you wouldn't take a knife to a gunfight, but it's still important to know if you're in a gunfight or not. And that's what Tuckman helps us to do. Okay, so once we've dealt with conflict, then we start moving towards things like norming and performing. And again, taking a page out of Tuckman's original book, we can think about two things for each stage. What's going on with the people, especially thinking about their behaviors, and those behaviors that might help us identify which stage we are in, and what's going on with the task, that is, how well are we performing. And often these are related. Well, they're always related, and one can see, for example, how we would be unable to progress too far if we're in constant conflict. And so with conflict, it's likely that performance will suffer. But the same is true by not having prescribed processes, for example those laid out in the norming stage, that allow us to understand what the rules are and how we're supposed to be working together. And that essentially is the ultimate answer to so what. Basically, if you can figure out what stage you're in, which is what Tuckman helps us to do, then you can start figuring out how to get to where you want to be. So hopefully that gives you some insight into what Tuckman's model is all about and how we might use it and the various strengths and weaknesses. Now, what I think is important is that we do have to acknowledge that there are weaknesses, and it's these weaknesses that people seem to be criticizing in much of the team dynamics literature, especially new ideas around agile methodologies. And they're not entirely wrong, because we can't ask too much of Tuckman's model. It was literally a classification of the stages through which groups progress, and it was developed in a specific context more than 50 years ago. It was never meant to be prescriptive, but far more descriptive. And that's where its power lies and how we should use it. It's never going to tell us the various dimensions of each phase. It's never going to be able to give us insight into the exact things that we might need to do. And yes, reality is messy. Very few teams, particularly modern teams, ever go through the same process, the same cycle, and in the same way. And for this reason, we have, for example, systems perspectives that say, well, it's not really stages, it's more a constant state of flux embedded in specific contexts. And we have punctuated equilibrium models that say, well, yes, there's stages, but they're never as neat as Tuchman expects them to be. And we don't necessarily go through these very specific stages, but jump from one equilibrium point to another and back and forth. And I agree wholeheartedly with most of these critiques. But again, it's a simple model and it's catchy, it's easy to remember, and in particular, it reminds us of the importance of the forming and storming stages. Because for me, those are the ones, in my experience, that teams tend to struggle the most with. If you can get your team onto the same page, handle conflict, and set up some processes by which to do so, you're already going to be a step ahead of most teams that are in existence today. And I'll also end off by saying that as much as there's evidence to suggest Tuchman might not always be applicable, there is a ton of literature for the past 5 decades that say it's a pretty good bet. So that's our view from the WorkWise Institute and why we tend to enjoy using Tuchman in team development interventions, but we'll leave you to decide. Obviously, there's going to be many more videos where we'll explore some of the factors that Tuchman never did, and we'll take you into some of the factors that we need to consider beyond just a simple stage-based model. So thank you kindly for watching, and hopefully we'll see you in the next one.